What is UV resin? What exactly do you need it for? What is the difference to other resins? And does it make sense to buy UV resin? And why has Calaberry not yet included it in its range? There is now something for your ears, and I hope later also some resin in your mixing cup. Hello, my dear resin friends. Here is your Mrs. Calaberry again with a new, very interesting podcast about UV resin. For all of you who don't know me yet, my name is Steffi, but better known under the pen name Mrs. Calaberry, and I founded my own company Calaberry in 2017 for high-quality resin products. I myself am an entrepreneur, but also a resin artist and have been involved with resin on a daily basis since day one of my resin career. So, glad you're with me. Let's get started. Here I share my knowledge. As always, let's start with some basic knowledge. There are many different resins on the market. Just to name a few: epoxy resin, polyester resin, polyurethane resin, silicone resin, vinyl ester resin, and UV resin. Probably the most common resin for us artists is the epoxy resin because it simply has the best properties for us for an art project. The epoxy resin always consists of two components, resin and hardener, which you get separately in bottles and then mix it together yourself at home depending on the mixing ratio and then pour. The UV resin, however, is only one component, so you only get one bottle. The UV resin is usually a combination of acrylic resin and a photo-initiating additive. This means that this resin cures only with a UV lamp. Very briefly explained, you squeeze the UV resin out of the bottle. If you like it, you can also mix it with colors and then apply it, for example, in a silicone mold and hold a UV lamp over it to cure within a few minutes. So this is a resin for impatient resin artists. But let's talk briefly about the advantages and disadvantages of UV resin. First, I would love to tell you the advantages. Number 1. Since the UV resin consists only of one component, you do not need to mix anything, like with the classic epoxy resin and hardener. For example, the source of error, like not mixed correctly or wrong mixing ratio, is eliminated. The UV resin only needs a UV lamp for curing. Number 2. The processing time is very long. Since the curing of the UV resin only begins with a UV light lamp, you can play with it for what feels like forever. With the classic epoxy resins, you always have a limited processing time of 15 or sometimes even 60 minutes. Number 3, curing is within minutes. Once the UV light is held over the UV resin, curing occurs within a few minutes. In some cases, it's 2 or 3 minutes. With epoxy resin, however, curing takes several hours or even days. That sounds good at first, doesn't it? But there are reasons why Calaberry has not yet included UV resin in its range. So let me now talk about the disadvantages of UV resin. Common epoxy resins have a shelf life of 24 months, so 1 or 2 years. The UV resin, however, unfortunately only 6 months. If you now consider the supply chain until such a UV resin is available in the stores, it can take 3 months very quickly. And then there is the storage time until it's finally sold. It can happen very quickly that you already buy an expired, no longer durable UV resin. Do you have a UV resin already at home? Have a look if there is an expiry date on the bottles. With epoxies, we have so many options in processing. Thin coats, medium coats, high casts, depending on the epoxy properties. With the UV resin, unfortunately, only thin layers are possible, especially up to max 3 millimeters. So if you have a classic coaster with, for example, 1 centimeter, you have to apply 3 layers of UV resin. And if you now consider that UV resin is much more expensive to purchase than epoxy resins, such a coaster is quite expensive. Here is a calculation example as of today, July 2023, and I don't know how prices will change in the future. So, 1 kg UV resin costs on average 200 euros. Yes. Well, at first you don't notice it so much because they are mostly small bottles with 50 ml, which then cost only 10 euro. A classic coaster made of resin is cast with about 100 ml of resin. For example, the resin costs for a coaster made of epoxy resins are 2-3 euro. The same coaster made of UV resin is 20 euro. And remember, you only have one coaster. Usually, you always have a set consisting of 4. Quite an expensive affair or hobby when you consider that people always say that resin is so expensive as a hobby. With UV resin, now it's even more. Another disadvantage is the UV lamp. Why do you ask? Well, such a UV lamp is a one-time purchase of 10-20 euros. This lamp should have at least 4 watts. This is not so tragic, but did you know that some UV lamps produce UVC light? This light causes the UV resin to yellow even faster, as it actually already happens faster with UV resin compared to classic epoxy resin. And that's not all. These UV lamps only come in certain sizes, so you're very limited with the curing area. So it's really only worth casting smaller items with UV resin. Or can you imagine the time you have to invest here to let a resin ocean art completely cure on a canvas poured with UV resin? And unfortunately, that's still not it with the disadvantages. Effects like cells in the resin, so nice waves or special sails, are not possible to create with UV resin. On the one hand, the viscosity does not allow it, and on the other hand, working with a heat gun or a blowtorch with UV resin is not recommended. Why? If you want to create cells with epoxy resin, you usually do this with the heat gun and blow the resin in a certain direction, so that you get the so-called lacing effect. UV resin must not be treated with a blowtorch or a heat gun for more than 2 or 3 seconds because it quickly develops a very sharp, almost corrosive odor which the UV resin gives off and which is harmful. Honestly, it's not really pleasant either because I've already tried it. UV resin also gives off an extreme heat during this rapid curing. For example, please do not touch the cured UV resin immediately after the UV light treatment because you can burn your fingers. And in this context, one more disadvantage. Many people already know it when the silicone mold sticks together with the epoxy resin, when it melts. Where does this come from? By overheated epoxy resin. For example, epoxy resin is made too hot. But now we pour UV resin into the silicone mold. UV resin produces a strong heat all by itself without any additional blowtorch or heat gun. What happens? Exactly this heat development damages your silicone molds even more than classic epoxy resin in the long run, and also UV resin can stick to the silicone mold. So, now it is enough with the disadvantages. You see that I, as an entrepreneur of Carlsberg, I am not 100% convinced to include this UV resin in the assortment. However, there are 1 or 2 situations for me as a resin artist where I can imagine this UV resin in some of my applications. For example, when I want to attach the ice cream on the canvas in a slanted position in my popsicle art. Here, a fast-curing resin would often be useful for me. So I can only recommend the UV resin to you as a quick glue for small items. Here, the UV resin is almost unrivaled. But if you want to try UV resin and garner your own experience, then just take a look at Amazon and search directly for UV resin. You won't find any of the Colorberry brand, but there are a few other brands that are currently jumping on this bandwagon. I'm still personally averse, but they're never. In this sense, thank you for listening. If you have any questions or suggestions to topics which burn under your nails, write me simply an email to help@colorberry.de. I'm looking forward to the next time. Yours, Colorberry.